Welcome to everyone, both here and also we have a live webcast this evening. This is the last public event of our school year, or our academic year. So we're really excited to celebrate with two of our leading affiliated scholars, Johanna and Christian, and a wonderful panel that we have representing some of these issues this evening. So with that, welcome to all of you out in the digital world, and welcome to all of you here in the room. With that in mind, because it is our last public event and the setting is so lovely, I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge our Stanford PACS and SSIR teams. This event, the logistics and programming and materials and all of that was led by the Stanford PACS team. If you look back that direction, Wubzena Jafar, our program manager, Annie Rohan, our director of external relations and partnerships, and then Priya Shankar, our Director of Finance, Operations and Grants Management, a small but mighty team there. So thank you. Really wonderful that you've been able to put this together so nicely for the evening. Additionally, we have our SSIR team, and as we move through the program tonight, you'll hear a little bit about how Johanna and Christian, our featured scholars, have been so engaged in SSIR. We have our managing editor, Eric Nee. You guys can stand up and wave in the back. Eric Nee, our managing editor. David Johnson, our senior editor. Justine Drennan, another editor. And a postdoc next to her, Claire, and another scholar, Bruce Sievers, at the table, and I saw Ling, another postdoc, coming through the door. So a number of Stanford PACS and SSIR folks here this evening. The reason I say all of that and share is at some point during the reception, hopefully you can connect with them. They're very close to our work, and there's just a lot going on, as you will see. So for those of you who are new, I'm Kim Meredith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And we are a research center where scholars, practitioners, and leaders come together to explore ideas for social change. So we actually care about bridging research into practice. We have three goals, and they are: one, to expand research in the field of philanthropy and social innovation; two, to increase the pipeline talent into the sector, scholars, practitioners, or leaders; and three, to improve the practice and effectiveness of philanthropy and social innovation. So with that in mind, in 2010, we had the opportunity to bring SSIR into Stanford PACS from the Graduate School of Business, bring it into our interdisciplinary center. And at that time, we needed to bring on an academic editor. So we put out the feelers and did our own search and wanted to find top scholar in social innovation space. And we had the great opportunity to attract Johanna Mair, who is the academic editor for SSIR, to our team. With that, it led us to this 3-year signature research project that Johanna and Christian came together on, that the Rockefeller Foundation funded. And that led, over the years, their affiliation with us and the research that they have been doing, building on decades of work, led to their first article in August of 2012, Innovation is Not the Holy Grail, which many of you have probably read. Then the next year, in 2013, as part of the Rockefeller Centennial, there was a special section on social innovation, and they had a marvelous article on Scale and Impact, a Tough Balancing Act. And then subsequently this fall, and we have issues of the SSIR cover article, When Innovation Goes Wrong. And then that leads us to where we are today, Innovation and Scaling for Impact, their book, bringing all of their years of research together. So with that in mind, I'm truly honored and thrilled to welcome Johanna and Christian in the panel. Johanna is our academic editor of SSIR, a distinguished fellow at Stanford PACS, a professor of organization, management, and leadership at Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Christian is the Leo Tindemans Business Model Innovations Chair and Faculty Member at KU Leuven in Belgium in the Economics Department. We also have this evening, and we will hear from Renee Kaplan, who is Chief of Strategy at the Skoll Foundation, Rolf Steiner, who is Chief Intellectual, I need to get that right, Chief Intellectual Officer, I believe it is, at Omidyar Network. That's a great title, Roy. It just is. I'm sure many people in the room would like to have that. And then we have Jim Bildner, who is CEO of the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Johanna and Christian to frame how the evening will set out. Then we'll hear from Christian, and then we'll have a panel. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you to Stanford PAX for giving us the opportunity to talk about the book tonight. But tonight we have the great fortune not only to talk about our book, but also to go beyond the book and have a panel conversation about organizations, innovations, scaling, impact with those who actually invest in organization to do that work. So I would like you to stay focused for the first 20 minutes of this evening and stay with us. More specifically, stay with Christian and adopt an organizational lens to understand how innovation and scaling create impact. Our book takes on the lens of organizations, and we prepared for two things. One, for demystifying innovation. What we try to do is get to the core of what is really the role of innovation in creating impact. And second, we try to understand how innovation and scaling as two distinct organizational processes actually create impact. After the presentation of Christian, we will actually invite our guests and distinguished panelists on stage and have a serious conversation about what all this means for those that invest in impact through organizations. And I'm really looking forward to that conversation. It's going to be a conversation that is not scripted, and we all would like to invite you to join that conversation after first round across us. You know the organizations Kim introduced, all three of them had a significant role in shaping this field of practice of social innovation. But now, without further ado, Christian, please.
So innovation, scaling, and impact, three individually interesting topics, but we rarely consider how they hang together, how they depend on each other, how they influence each other. So in the book, we propose a complete framework of thinking these dependencies through to enable funders, managers in organizations, but also consultants make better decisions about allocating resources to innovation or scaling, and with which expectations, and how does it all translate into impact. So let me introduce to you a few of the organizations that we've studied and some of the key arguments in the book. One organization that most of you probably know is the Aravind Eye Hospital in India. It's one of the largest eye hospitals in the world. They see about 3.5 million patients per year. They do about 300,000 cataract surgeries per year. Many would say Aravind is one of the most innovative eye hospitals in the world. What appears is that innovation does not play a major role or the most important role in their impact creation model. What we find is an organization that works very, very hard every day around a number of well-established core routine practices that they've developed over a long time through a lot of repetition, focus, and commitment. But despite this routinized work that Aravind is doing, it's a tremendously agile organization. And behind this agility, this is what we find interesting, these agile organizations, what drives this agility? One is, Aravind has a very clear sense of mission and identity. Eliminating unnecessary blindness. This mission is being upheld every day by senior management to remind people why it's worthwhile to get out of bed in the morning and do the hard routine work, right? It's this work around their identity that provides tremendous motivation to everyone all the time. And it also provides this sense of never being satisfied with the successes that they achieve. They are well aware that they are successful, but they're never satisfied with that. They never pat themselves on the shoulder. At the same time, Aravind puts forward a number of tough strategic objectives. They say, we want to do 2/3 of eye surgeries for free for the poorest of the poor. We only want to do very high quality eye surgeries for everyone, independent of whether you pay or not. And we want to make a significant profit margin so that we can expand operations independent of government, the private sector, and mostly also funders very often. Right? This is a very tough set of factors that creates tremendous organizational stress. We call it productive management of productive management of organizational stress. Everyone at Aravind runs around every day and needs to report on what problems they've identified and what ideas for improvements they have identified and enact. It's this constant pushing and refinement that generates tremendous, in small steps, tremendous impact over time. We find many of the same features in another organization that probably also most of you know, BRAC, one of the largest NGOs in the world, operating in Bangladesh, but also more internationally recently. We find many of the same ingredients there as well. Behind the impact of BRAC is not so much innovation as the prominent driving force, but we feel that their agility comes from many of the same factors that we see in Aravind. So this person here, the so-called field marshal, a senior manager that was in charge of BRAC's field operations for most of BRAC's history, who unfortunately died in 2010. And the quotes are out of a Daily Star article about that. He had two roles, the field marshal. One of his roles was that every year he was lifting the bar from 100% targets to 120%, every year creating this positive stress and stretch for the organization. And the second role was, he was signaling and living how BRAC expected every staff to go about their work. And one of these elements was, like with Aravind, a deep incubation with problems. Understanding the economic, cognitive, normative, and power dynamics of social and environmental problems. What creates them, what sustains them, as an input in designing effective solutions and better, more realistic ideas. But also this notion of direct observation. Most of BRAC's managers spend more time in the field, much more time in the field than in the office. They get their fingers dirty, they engage with communities. It provides tremendous emotional power if you not only understand the problems, but also see the misery, but also the hope that exists in many communities, right? This quality of power. And BRAC has another thing where they mirror Aravind. They hold on to their senior managers, often for 20 or 30 years. This is how tremendous knowledge accumulates into very deep competencies in the organization and in their individuals. So as you can see here, the article claims that the field marshal had expertise in many areas and more. But this is where an agile organization that can take on lots and create lots of ideas come from. And it's the same thing as in Aravind. You create productive stretch and you build the competencies and the organizational infrastructure to enable people to solve and identify problems and opportunities all the time. Right? Requires investments. You don't get lucky in achieving that. You may get lucky with innovation, we talk about it, but you don't get lucky building an agile organization. It requires investments in infrastructure. What BRAC also does is they invest in overhead significantly from the beginning. Systematic learning and evaluation units, monitoring units, training units. They don't shy away from investing in organizational infrastructure. as a basis for agility. So looking at the number of organizations, we find a simple but very useful central framework in our book that we call the impact creation logic. It's the organizational architecture that drives agility and is required for impact creation. And it says that the ability of an organization to create impact is a function of the depth of knowledge in 3 dimensions and the extent to which these dimensions reinforce each other. One dimension is the ability of organizations to accumulate important what knowledge. What are the factors that create and sustain important social and environmental problems? Really, this deep understanding of social, of problem spaces, right? Which requires all this hands-on engagement of the organization in the field with the people, with the problems. The second dimension is the how knowledge. How do we access, nurture, and configure various resources into effective bundles of solutions, right? That requires a lot of experimenting, fine-tuning, until you eventually come up with what we call deep organizational competency, doing something really, really well. Those two things, those two spaces constitute the potential, but they're not sufficient. This is where we're often stuck in strategy work. We look at customer needs and solutions, but we often forget the rest of the organization. This is what we call the identity space, an articulation of why it's worthwhile to get out of bed every morning and do the hard work. Because this identity space, this clarity of who you are, which is a unique way of knowing, provides tremendous motivation and this ambition to try harder and harder and harder despite being successful. So where these 3 elements come together, this is the basis of agility. And every organization has an impact creation logic, some form of an impact creation logic, some understanding of some problem, a few resources, and a mission statement, at least on paper. But usually, most organizations have a very weak impact creation logic, right? Very few organizations really are penetrating all 3 dimensions very, very deeply and keep working on improving it and bringing it together so that they reinforce each other. So most organizations, unfortunately, and particularly in the NGO world, in my view, have very weak impact creation logics. The bottleneck, and this is one of the arguments we try to make in the book, and that's why it's maybe a retro book, the bottleneck for impact may not be so much innovation, but the ability to manage agility. How does innovation link into all of this now? Let's look at an innovation process, how it unfolds in organizations. This is a typical innovation process. It starts with something like, I have an idea for some reason. Sounds great, it works. The customer likes it, it's not proprietary. Yes, it is. Field trial worked. Oh no, costs are too high. Failures in the field trial. We have a fix, it works. It doesn't always. New costs look great. Oh no, they need all the sizes. We don't have enough resources. The boss hates the project. And so on, this is a tough journey. This is very difficult to manage for organizations. This is usually it takes longer than you think it takes. And it's this constant emotional roller coaster, all these up and downs that are very, very difficult for organizations to manage. So what we've learned is if you come to innovation from an expectation of success, you will be disappointed most of the time. I think it's really smart when you think about innovation processes to come at it from a learning perspective. Don't expect success necessarily, but expect radical learning. Because as you continue to learn, your ideas will get better over time. You will accumulate resources for trying them out, and your experience base will make sure that eventually you will succeed, right? But if you expect success, you may stop things too early or start blaming people for failures. So this is what we see, how innovation processes are very different from these types of routine problems that Aravind creates, small problems every day that create tremendous impact immediately, versus allocating resources to these types of ideas where you never know what comes out of it and when, and whether it creates positive or negative impact. You can't tell from innovation. It's a very different game, right? Routine versus innovation. 2 different pathways to impact. Let me illustrate this with an example. And again, don't let me confuse you with these displays. These are our analytical displays by which we trace the long-term trajectories of organizations. So don't bother about the details. I'll explain the story to you. A group of students went from southern India to northern India in the early 70s to do rehabilitation work after a devastating cyclone in India. Some of them stayed on after a year and said, we want to work on something that is deeply matches some values that we hold. We want to work on the issue of inequality in rural villages in India. This was promoted by Gandhi, and the students were very inspired by that. The problem is that most of their first innovations failed. This is where it says past discontinued. And when we go on the next years, lots of the early innovations failed. Reasons were they didn't understand the problems correctly. Some of their innovations actually made things worse. There were unintended negative consequences of innovations. Sometimes the communities didn't want to adopt their wonderful innovations. For example, in a dairy project where they built a dairy production facility, and then it turns out that local communities don't consume milk. So there you are with your innovation. So a lot of things went wrong. In the education sector, there was solution uncertainty. They didn't know how to access and bundle solutions into an effective solutions. So a lot of failure initially. And eventually they found an innovation that actually worked around biogas. So they moved away from inequality for a period of time and said, wow, we actually have a side product of a failed innovation, which is cow dung from the dairy production plant. Let's turn this into biogas, and there was a huge need for energy, cheap energy sources. Within 10 years, it became one of the largest biogas providers in India. A very successful technical innovation. But the problem was, so here we have the problem and the solution, really coming together for them, right? But the thing was the identity space. It wasn't what they wanted to do. They wanted to work on inequality. That's what motivated them, not so much on energy and biogas. So they discontinued that innovation and went back to the drawing board. Now, for the first time, being able to create a real impact creation logic. They had a deep understanding of problem spaces from all their failed innovations in the beginning. Innovation failure, when you learn, accumulates deep knowledge about how systems and problems really tick. They had an appetite for scale that they got from the technology project. And they were very clear about who they wanted to be going forward and not, right? They wanted to work on inequality. This was what motivated them. Now they brought together an impact creation logic. It's now called Mantra, a program that they've now rolled out over about 1,300 villages in India. Truly transforming a whole village around gender and caste discrimination and dramatically reducing levels of inequality. So that illustrates another framework where we say that innovation processes, when you innovate, what guides your learning is keep those 6 dimensions of uncertainty in mind. We see them again and again. Problem frame uncertainty, do you understand the problem sufficiently that you're trying sufficiently that you're trying to solve? Solution uncertainty, can you access and bundle resources into an effective solution? Adoption uncertainty, will anyone like what you're producing in your wonderful innovation? Consequence uncertainty, are you creating potentially negative unintended consequences? Like every good drug has these side effects. Social innovations may have sometimes severe consequences for vulnerable communities. We got to be extra careful about that. Identity uncertainty, the innovation, does this lure you in a direction that may not be linked to your deepest sense of identity, right? So watch these types of uncertainties and turn this into a learning device, because the objective of innovation is not to create impact, but to create an impact creation logic, to create sufficient what, how, and why knowledge that is required for scaling impact, and then becoming an agile organization and creating more and more impact over time. So this is how we look then at innovation and scaling and how they hang together. For us, innovation is an investment, doesn't create impact, at least not directly. Even if it's successful, it only creates a potential. The question is, can you turn the innovation into an effective impact creation logic and work hard to get better at your processes and products that come out of the innovation, make them more productive, make them more robust, extend them, serve more people better. Scaling creates impact from the investment of innovation. This is how we look at it, and I think this is not the only way to look at it, but we found this a very, very fruitful and pragmatic lens of understanding that. One of the things that it gave rise to, do I have another 2 minutes? 3 minutes? Great. Is to turn this whole thing into a diagnostic around innovation pathologies. We found 6 ways in which organizations often systematically make innovations unproductive. 2 are never get started. Right? Might be a really good idea and a privileged opportunity, but then everyone's busy, or ideas are being discussed forever, so the one who had the idea is losing all hope and motivation and momentum. There may not be resources available, or whatever reasons why you never get started. Even worse is too many bad ideas. Maybe only the boss is allowed to have ideas and get resources for innovation projects. But bosses sometimes spend a lot of time in the office and not in the field, and therefore may not always have the best ideas, right? Or big funders. One of the organizations told us that they're running 10 pilots on the side to please a big funder who asked them, why don't you try this, why don't you try that? Not much good will come out of that. What it means is you're wasting resources, you're running the full investment in innovation, but you're very unlikely to create much impact out of them, right? So the return on innovation investment is negative. 2 other pathologies we see very often: stop too early. You think there should be linear progress around milestones, right? But innovation is this nonlinear up and down process. So if you measure progress with the wrong metrics, you conclude that this is obviously not working. Let's withdraw resources for a more important project, right? Or you may not have dedicated resources, and then key people are being easily moved from one project to another important project because some manager wants it that way, and so on and so on and so on. Or stop too late is obviously not working, but no one wants to tell the boss, right? And no one wants to be the bringer of the bad news. Or you've invested, you have a dedicated innovation budget. Who wants to return a budget to the funder? Well, let's just use it up, even though it's not working, but let's just keep going until the budget is used up, and we are asking for a new grant next year. Things like that. Other 2 pathologies we see is insufficient exploitation, when you're not able to turn innovation into an impact creation logic, because a lot of these inspiring young social entrepreneurs are really good on the idea creation front, but not really good at managing and building productive organizations. It seems to be a real bottleneck. Or there is, and this is a quote from one of our organizations, not from me. They said, we see so many NGOs in our country that never build any key competencies. They jump from one grant to another grant, always using the word innovation in the grant, because then they are more likely to get money, but they never really build any deep competencies. So if you innovate too much, you will never really get good at anything, right? So we've described an article in 2016, and we highly encourage you, do this in your own organizations. Do an innovation pathologist workshop. It's very easy to do, but it has a potentially very healing effect, right? If you want to run, and if innovation is like running, you want to have a good heart first, right? You want to heal yourself from your kind of pathologist first, and then you can run. So start innovations with doing an innovation pathologist workshop. We describe it in all details. It's very easy to do. But it turns unproductive innovation into a strategic discussion in organizations from which you are more likely to make progress. And finally, again, I really don't want to introduce yet another framework, and there are many more in the book, but we should not only consider innovation and scaling as one process that hangs together, but also how innovation and scaling hang together over time. And what we find is that organizations have different archetypes that may be individually effective and may actually be good models to think about your own long-term journey, because we feel that integration ought to be integrated in a long-term strategy and not just be isolated ideas and events, right? So what we see is the journey of Gramvikas. Remember all the failed innovation in the beginning with nothing to show for. Then finally they stumbled on biogas and scaled it and therefore built whole new organizational competencies, went back to the drawing board, and now they're scaling forever because there's positive demand, and they're not playing around with innovations now. It's much more efficient to allocate resources to scaling and doing what they do well, one village at a time. 1,200 villages, next year it will be 1,500 villages, and so on and so on. Aravind is this hardworking, agile eye hospital, right? It's not an innovative organization, but their culture of constant learning and problem solving helps when you must innovate. So Aravind runs into bottlenecks because what they want to do is scale their cataract surgical capacities, right? Sometimes they run into bottlenecks, and then they come together and innovate around that bottleneck. They keep their innovations very close to their core, and therefore they can innovate more productively at lower degrees of uncertainty because they keep their innovations. They don't try to branch out. Branching out is something that BRAC does. That is why BRAC has a much more developed organizational infrastructure. If you want to get good at unrelated innovations and scaling at the same time, you better think about organizational infrastructure to make that possible. It's very hard to do. Right? And the fourth archetype that we found is 2 innovators in Bangladesh working on resource use and waste and turning it into productive resources. But they don't want to run big organizations. They potentially have the pathology of insufficient scaling. They don't want to scale. What they do is they innovate following the principles of the theory of diffusion. How can we create innovations in such a way that other organizations can adopt them more easily and then scale them, right? Aravind doesn't do that. No one can do what Aravind does. So Aravind system is not replicable, really, because Aravind innovated only for themselves to make it work for them. These guys they innovate in such a way that others can adopt their innovations and then scale them up. And then they can go back to the drawing board and do something new, because this is what drives them. This is what we find, and these are just some ideas that we're playing around with right now and that are in the book. It's part of a journey, and we really hope that you will engage in this journey. We need to learn much more. We need to get better at supporting organizations and finding content and knowledge that is, in a way valid, not based on just illusions and hopes, but it's also practical in some way. So please stay engaged. Thanks for letting me do that.
Are they all on? Yeah, they are. Thank you so much for getting us going, Christian. Kim mentioned it, the book project started out of a conversation with the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's exemplary how we actually like to do research, both Christian and I, also especially here under the umbrella of Stanford PACS, our home for the signature project. It came from a conversation with the Rockefeller Foundation where they asked us, can you help us to unpack what it means for an organization to continuously innovate? And that really triggered this idea of ours to look at the innovation trajectory of these organizations rather than at looking at innovation at just this one product or this one service that they innovate. So taking also to trajectory the evolution of organizations seriously to understand how they actually do create impact. We dedicated the book to all the social enterprises that do this incredible work, and some of you are here today. But we also wanted to write this book to forge a conversation with those that invest in, that fund social enterprises, that fund impact in a way. And this is why we are extremely grateful that we have 3 organizations here and 3 remarkable leaders of organizations, and to continue this conversation going beyond the organizational frame and really try to understand what it means to learn. Christian mentioned that if you don't know how to learn, don't innovate. So I want to also continue this thread in our conversation. We'll have a first round and probably a second round of discussion here before we open up. Perhaps, Roy, I can start with you because you have this incredible title of Director of Learning and Impact, and you are responsible for nothing more than turning Omidyar Network into innovative and productive learning organization. So my question to you is, how do you learn as an organization? Omidyar Network, I don't have to introduce your organization. It's very well known, one of the pioneers investing in impact, very much also focused on the idea of leveraging the power of markets to do so. Over the last 15 years, really turning into almost like a conglomerate, if you will, of impact creation. Roy, how do you learn?
That's a great question. It is my job, so I better have an answer. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for writing the book. It's been really great to read. Well, at Omidyar, I would just say the answer is really twofold. It actually starts ultimately with culture. If you don't have a culture of humility and trust and curiosity, you don't learn very well, no matter what kind of processes you have in place, and I'll come back to that. And then secondly, for us, what we've been trying to do is create a set of what we're calling our learning architecture. These set of processes that help you, get you to remember to learn, because you get so busy, if you don't put points in time, you actually don't create that opportunity for the learning to take place. And the way we do it is, it starts like everywhere else, system-informed strategies. We're dealing with these really complex systems. I loved all the innovation, unknowns that you laid out, those 6, because you're dealing with these spaces. We're trying to improve financial inclusion or change the education. There's so many unknowns. You have to create a vision of the world, and we use our own sort of system mapping work with the recognition that whatever map you create of the world, it is going to be wrong, which is the reason why you have to get you have to be open to being wrong. Our investments are always based on as clear a hypothesis as possible, and we try to write that down clearly so that we can go back to it. The reality is your hypothesis is going to be wrong, but if you write it down really clear, when reality happens, the variance between what happened and what you thought was going to happen is where the real learning potential is. And so we found that previously we didn't do that very well. It was kind of vague. And one of my big challenges with a lot of philanthropies is when things go wrong, they go, well, it was for learning. We're taking risk. And that's what happens when you take risk. And when I ask, you probe, okay, tell me exactly what you learned. A lot of times you get these banal answers like leadership is important, or you shouldn't invest in things with negative IRR. I mean, it's really not it's not learning, because it's clear they didn't clarify what they were trying to accomplish. The third set of processes that we are trying to implement is a systematic reflection. And for a long time, we didn't actually do things like after-action reviews, which is this point in time when you're reinvesting or where something ends, to really step back and go, okay, what did this say about the world, the system? It's all of those things that force you to deal in many cases with failure, which requires a level of trust, which is really hard. None of us like to fail, even though we supposedly celebrate it. And then we do a lot of insight gathering to kind of make sure that we're paying attention to the outside world. In all of this, and I'll end with this, is trying to get as much rich feedback as possible. As Christian has said, human beings are wonderful, and many people have said that we are amazing at self-delusion. We all are in our own little worlds, and we have a model of the world. And luckily, my model is different from Renee's model, which is different. My illusion is different from Johanna's. And if we discuss it enough, we can get slightly better, closer to the truth. And really listening. And one of the things that's so amazing about Brock is they really do listen to their constituents. We are really trying to get all of our investments to listen systematically with the people they're serving, because for example, we have a partnership with the Acumen Fund's Lean Data, and everybody thinks they know what their customers or their constituents want or need or desire, and they're always wrong in some form or fashion, and which is the other reason why you have to have that humility. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Roy. Renee, For the last 6 years and a half, you have been the chief strategist at the Skoll Foundation. Also the Skoll Foundation, one of the pioneers, one of those organizations that really also shaped the field of social innovation. I think it was 2005 when you gave out the first awards for social entrepreneurs. Some of them are here today. Now, the idea was like to celebrate social entrepreneurs, but you also have decided along the way to hang in there with them, right? And many of the social entrepreneurs you celebrated first, they obviously also had their own trajectory, their own journey. So tell us a little bit more how you, as an organization such as the Skoll Foundation, strategize with them. How do you interact with them that you make sure that you are a really trusted partner along their journey? Some of the learnings along that path.
Sure. I think, it has been a journey. I think we talk about philanthropy, and particularly in the funder side, as I say a lot, we're the only ones that have the real luxury to sit back and think. Versus any other sector. And our entrepreneurs are on the ground every day, working to make payroll, working to serve their clients. And, we often come in, and I agree with Roy, there's a lot to be learned from a funder community of what we need to do better. So from our perspective, the partnerships with the entrepreneurs are the core of who we are and what we do. If we don't have that, we're not relevant. The hard part of that is how do you do that over time? So Skoll invests in social entrepreneurs. We do primarily unrestricted funding, and we would love to see more funders do unrestricted funding. And it sounds tactical, but it is strategic. And I'll tell you why. Because the partnership then that we can have and the conversations we can have with the entrepreneurs become instantly transparent. If our funding can allow them to do R&D, or we say, this is what we expect and what we hope our investment, the outcomes we hope that we together can achieve, and then midway, and this happens a lot for us, and maybe it's not even midway, maybe it's a year in, the organization says, what we thought we were doing, it didn't work, or it's changing, or where the real opportunity is over here. Can we divert, or can we change the funding? And this is where we need to go. We need to do it tomorrow. And we can say, and in fact, a lot of times they don't need our approval, but we can have that conversation. And then they can shift and they can do what's really valuable. And if you have restricted funding, if you have really strict milestone or grant reporting restrictions on these entrepreneurs, they cannot innovate in a way that we hope that, and we say we want them to. So I think there's a fundamental disconnect that we have to address with how funders partner with organizations that they're investing in. And for us, we're trying to do a better job. It's a long-term journey. The other part I would say is the long-term funding needs to be there, along with a strategy of, are we really clear, back to understanding the system or the problem we're trying to solve? Are we really clear together what we're trying to do? And can we, instead of doing overcorrecting on measurement and evaluation and burdening the social entrepreneur with too much metrics, can we agree on concrete milestones over time that we can try to target and then continue to check in on and work together? And where can the funding, and again, from a partnership perspective, beyond money, where can we come in with strategic value, connections, storytelling, other kinds of assets that can be put to good use in that way?
So a model centered on partnership. Jim, Draper Richards Kaplan just turned 15. Exactly. You have invested
But do I look 15? If Bill were here, he's going to be 90, and it's amazing, Bill Draper, and we have Christy Chin, our managing partner, and Natalie here as well, but anyhow, I'll get to that in a second.
You have been investing in more than 110 enterprises, and you have had right from the beginning a very kind of crisp model and what you invest in, around ideas, innovation, entrepreneurs. Tell us what you have been learning over the last few years.
Right. So, first of all, it's wonderful to have, all of us here and all of you there, and really look at the ways. We all share this common desire, which is more urgent today than ever, which is we were fortunate we had this retreat a while ago, and the Surgeon General, just before he was fired, spoke to us, and he said, in a very personal story, that he was sitting with his wife and said, our society is sitting with the scales of justice, and on one side is love and on one side is fear. And he said to all of us that were there, he was uncertain as to which way we're going. And that uncertainty that certainly we feel, and I know our entrepreneurs feel, anchors the work we do. And when I think about scaling and innovation, for us, they're in service to impact. Our model is distinct from many others in that we do unrestricted funding, as you well know. But we only serve for 3 years, and the money is interesting and noted, and we'll have internal debates whether it's important at the end of the day, but I think we all believe that every one of our entrepreneurs would give us back our money if we would serve longer than a 3-year term. That 3-year term is critical because it gives us a sense of urgency for this work. And when we think about what distinguishes our work from others, it's that intense operating partnership that we have with our entrepreneurs. There's another dimension. The last thing we need probably is another framework here, or another systems map, but the context of what we're doing. So innovation and scaling is completely tied to the ability of organizations to absorb it. And there's a huge difference. We are early stage funders. By definition, generally speaking, our organizations are less than 3 years old. Generally speaking, they have less than $500,000 when they enter our portfolio. Their ability to absorb a framework that's as complex as the ones that you've seen are very different than BRAC or other larger entities that have been at this for a while. And so we see our work in making sure that as operating partners with them on a daily basis, we're there to both help them iterate, let them know that that's possible, as well as giving them instant feedback, because innovation is so hard for anybody to actually agree on what it is. To be honest, in our portfolio, most of our true innovation is repurposing something that's worked somewhere else in service of a different thing. And so both this stage-based understanding and this sector-based understanding, when you're really talking about repurposing systems or different methods of intervention or alleviation or mediation, is the way in which we can really add distinctive value. And that, what we've learned is that's 100% of the battle. What we've learned as well is that, leadership is not just a concept. We understand today that in most cases today when we're funding, we're going to fund a team, not a single individual. And why do we know that? Because the world's complex problems today are probably not going to be solved by a single individual. You need somebody who understands the domain. You need somebody who can actually operate. And that skill set, that partnership becomes the distinctive difference over a long period of time.
Thank you, Jim. What also surfaces from your comments is that you take an active role in making sure they are impactful, but giving them a hand. Let me get back to this thread of impact and pick you up also what you said. Like there's a commonality across the three of you. You all work for organizations that have living founders, living funders. And the organizations that we have worked, Christian and I, for the last 15 years, and it's more than the 4 we featured in the book, but all of them actually have a pretty good understanding what impact means for them. Now, Renee, you mentioned we might overdo it with our quest for how you have to measure impact, how you have to evaluate it. Let me turn the ball back to you guys. And I sense that all, the living founders that have been hanging in there for 15 years, a little bit longer in some cases, where do you see here the main focus of how they want to demonstrate their impact? I sense also a little bit of a sense of urgency on their behalf of how can we demonstrate that we are impactful? How do your organization look at impact that is more than the aggregated or the sum of the impacts of your investments? Any reflections on this to share here? And whoever wants to go first.
I can jump in. I think for Jeff Skoll, our founder, it's been a interesting journey from, spotlighting the leaders and an organization and an innovation and celebrating that, and that's kind of the model we started with, to how does this add up? So what? Yeah, there's a lot of organizations in the world doing great things. Where are we on the big problems? What impact can we show, and what systems are changing so this doesn't just repeat itself? And that for us is a big challenge, and we're still looking at how do we aggregate impact of all of our organizations to be able to show trends and kind of improvements and where things are really not working. So the patterns across now our portfolio is where we focus. Do we have common denominators of measurement, simple enough that we can actually look across 100 organizations with their input and say, here's where we think you are in your journey, are we right? And it's our assessment, and then be able to say, okay, across the 100, where does that fall out then, and in terms of progress on specific issues? And it's really challenging. Back to the complexity, I think for our founder, for Jeff, that's a hard thing. It's humbling, having also worked at the Giving Pledge and seeing a lot of those founders come in and their original expectations between what then 5, 10, 15 years later. One of the common denominators there is humility, because the social sector does not move fast. These impacts are hard to track, and it requires a lot of sector engagement and partnership. So for our founder, thankfully, I think he's absolutely impatient, but he's also humbled enough and knows that, trusts us enough that we can get there over time, as long as we're, being very transparent and hopefully showing results.
Roy, do you want to go next?
Well, there's certainly a level of changing urgency. I mean, I think the recent events in the U.S. in particular, if anybody follows Pierre's Twitter feed, knows he's very, very concerned about the state of the United States and where we're moving, and has asked us to really double down on thinking about what needs to shift and how do we change our approach. Just did a $100 million gift to investigative journalism because that's under attack. Very concerned about privacy. The fundamental issues of inequality and racism in the United States has just been complete. We have a new window on it, or the things have been. We can't ignore those facts the way we seem to have been ignoring them a bit, and so systems change and reality changes, and we got to change with it and rethink how we do things.
Yeah, so we're different. Bill Draper, Robin Richards, Donahoe, and Rob Kaplan have given us the legacy of a framework and certainly capital, but we also have the responsibility and the great privilege of stewarding 45 other individuals, family foundations, and now a number of institutional partners. So our duty of responsibility, particularly again as early stage funders, is to make sure that everything we do, we have a hypothesis, we have an investment theory, we have an impact theory, and in one hand we have the luxury of not overcomplicating it. So if we're looking at Serum, which was started here, it's repurposing pharmaceuticals. If we're looking at an entity that's just we approved last week, they're trying to prevent failures to appear, which issue bench warrants and which doom people. So we can measure our impact by the lives and the people we're touching. At the end of the day, again, because we're early stage, because these are relatively small organizations, because their budgets are small, what really matters is over time, how have they done and do they exist? So in the first instance, a sustainable business model, whether it's a for-profit entity or a non-profit entity, is what we focus on after we focus in on the problem set. So, I mean, in some ways we have the luxury of being able to look in the world and look very specifically at what we funded and see whether lives are saved, whether people appear in court, whether conditions for a very vulnerable population have changed. And on the other hand, we have the hard work that goes side by side with that to make sure that when our 3-year term is up, their boards are stronger, their impact is greater, there are other funders that follow us, because we never re-grant. So our job from day one is to make sure that there's a sustainable path at the exit point in year 3, and that is super hard work. But at the end of the day, that's why we exist. And one of the things we tell ourselves is we're basically going to market and validating our impact in the fund structure that we have. So if we're not creating impact, we wouldn't want to waste philanthropic capital, and that holds our team and us and our funders to just an incredibly high standard. And the greatest privilege of all is coming to our retreat, where our donors see firsthand a room double the size of people who are literally waking up every day in conflict zones, at great harm, at great personal sacrifice, for only one reason, because they're the folks that won't pass somebody whose life, but for their intervention, is going to be doomed.
Thank you, Jim. A last question for the moment refers back to also something that I picked up from each of you, actually, that comes along with this running out of patience with progress, and that relates to how can we make progress on problems that are more at the system level. So that also resonates with a frontier for Christian and myself, a research frontier for us. How can we think about organization impacting systems change that is on our mind as we speak? And Christian, feel free to chime in here. But I would be curious to understand how you move beyond just kind of having this very aspirational idea of how we can impact system or transform systems towards really a meaningful way of interacting with the organizations that you support and facilitating them to actually create that change at the system level.
Yeah, so we just went through this exercise with the criminal justice system. Because we had been seeing over our transom a number of incredible organizations working at reducing gun violence, reducing folks who are in jail because they can't pay bail, and looking at a number of different determinants that are creating this. Carter Stewart, one of our managing directors, was a former U.S. attorney from the Southern District of Ohio. So we had the great privilege of convening 11 of his peers from around the country to look at where could we actually have intervention in a meaningful way, which led us to really only 2 spots on this very complex. It makes Christian's innovation thing look simple. There were 2 spots on this entire systems map in criminal justice where we felt we could have impact, and it was 1, keeping people from getting in the system, and then the other is keeping them from getting back in the system once they've been in the system. But the entire middle zone, when we looked at real impact, was beyond our pay grade. We didn't have the discretion to really have impact on prosecutors, because frankly, if you look at U.S. attorneys, as you just witnessed, they all literally go away in one swoop every 4 years or every 8 years. So no matter how hard you work within that system to train them and to provide them different models, they're gone. And so that's what led us to focus in on those 2 areas, and that was really powerful for us.
Roy, I know that you do quite a bit of system work at Omidyar.
We do, and it's very hard to actually measure and change. And for example, our governance and civic engagement initiative has worked a lot in creating transparency and open data, and with the idea of making governments more accountable to the citizens. That's a really difficult system to shift. You can work on all of these different things, and even when you are successful, for example, we helped the legislation that got all the oil and gas companies to just declare the amount of money that went to African countries, and that took about 8 years of real work to get done. We got everybody signed up, and within the first week of this administration, they eliminated that need for transparency. And so all that 8 years of work, we thought we were successful. So I mean, you have to. In those sorts of situations, we recognize we're going to do a whole bunch of efforts, and many of them are not going to be successful. What we try to do is, at least out of 10, we need some really good breakthrough stories. We're never going to have counterfactuals. We're never going to have the RCTs in the system. But we should be able to have a really good narrative backed up by some data. And if we can't explain what we've done, then with some evidence, then we haven't done system change. But there's no, easy way to do it.
Thank you.
We have a real-time example, and it's in part helped by Omidyar and some of their learning, but one of our organizations is Health Leads, and it was started by an entrepreneur, Rebecca Oni, who was trying to look at the problem of, obviously, the tremendous healthcare costs, the 17% of GDP, and looking at how she could help doctors and patients connect to social services, and would that actually lower conditions and outcomes and costs. So whether it was food stamps, whether it was housing, whether it was good nutrition advice, could she be, so she started with health desks, literally set up in clinics that would allow doctors to write prescriptions for patients to go see the health desk, and then they would connect them to services. That model showed and proved out. So her plan was to just have health desks across the country and all the clinics and all the hospitals. Midway through, she realized this is not going to scale. This is not going to change the system. Some clinics may have a health desk, may not. How could she get into, it has to be in the policy side where governments are mandating and actually integrating this model of social determinants of health. That, thankfully, CMS recently, the Center for Medicaid Services and Medicare Services, looked at Health Leads and named them in a pilot. So their model got named in their pilot. They're now going to be, hopefully, looking at that proof point of these pilots, and that could change. CMS is a purchaser of over $975 billion of healthcare. So that's changing a system, potentially. What we did, though, she said, as we looked at this opportunity and reinvesting in Health Leads, well, where are the actors? Who are the other funders? How do we make sure that these pilots and what's going to happen here are actually successful? We have a systems mapping and an opportunity, but we have to be way more collective about this. It can't just be Health Leads coming to us and then coming to Omidyar or coming to Robert Wood Johnson and having funding. It has to be a collective action approach. So with the methodology that Omidyar has been using, we're actually testing that out. Can we map the funders? Can we see which levers actually could move within this 5 or 7 year period? Could we accelerate any of them? And then can we track the actual progress and have something to show for it at the end of the day? And storytell along the way so that we can be sharing that. And we'll see what happens, but we're at least excited in that shift from an investment perspective of working with others and saying, can we put the outcome we're all looking for at the center? Can we collectively plan and share the kind of metrics and outcomes that we're looking for? And we'll see.
System map tools are definitely a useful instrument, especially if you think about your portfolio of investment. Do I invest in the right organizations? They're not going to do the trick of actually doing the strategy or planning. So there's still a room for the organizations actually that have to do the hard work. Christian, do you want to say a little bit about systems and organizations before we open up the space for questions and hopefully answers?
How much time do I have? Turn this on. So it's interesting when some of you may know the famous book Grand Theory of Systems by Bertalan Lanfear, written in the 60s. If you read the introduction, you find his quote that few domains have become such a cliche than the work on systems and systems change. That was in the 1960s. It's just amazing. We have always been struggling with this system, but I think in the end, one of the ideas of the research program that Johanna and I now want to do is to be pragmatic about the system. Is there something in there, in this systems perspective, that we can really translate into actionable insights? And I think in the end it comes down for me to whether you're an entrepreneur or an organization, if you want to effect any form of desirable change, you need to create the conditions where you control causality. If you cannot put the right levers, the right mechanisms, the right causes into action to get the outcomes that you desire, you're lost. One of the problems I have with these massive systems, complex systems visualizations is they don't capture causality anymore. You have no causality. And the more complex you draw your systems, the less causality you have. So I really like the approach, the example that Jim just mentioned. You look at the system and then you identify where are the elements over which we might potentially have some causal control, and carve out smaller spaces of the system and start from there, rather than wasting a lot of time and resources and efforts of trying to visualize and somehow understand the whole complexity of the whole system. So I think there's a lot we need to learn of how to make this more practicable, but in the end, it all comes down to causality. I'm sorry, that's how it is. And I'm not saying that as a scholar, but someone who believes in a philosophy of science of how the world ticks.
And causation, I mean, the thing I think that we just forget is we look at populations that are suffering or deprived of systems or constrained, and we think that the initial causation must be something super complex. But literally in the criminal justice system, keeping people out of it can be as simple as a microfinance loan for $25 to pay a fine. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Or a failure to, why do people not fail to appear? They have childcare. They can't get to transportation. It snowed outside. I mean, these are not necessarily the most complex problems in the world, and so dedicating effort to look at that and keep them out of the system is not as hard in some cases as it may seem. And that, to me, is the real insight, this difference between observation and insight.
Thank you, Jim. We have now room for questions. So please come forward. We have some microphones here. Jim, we all know you, but nevertheless, I would like to encourage you to actually briefly just introduce yourself if you have a question.
Hi, I'm Jim Fruchterman, founder of Benetech here in Palo Alto. And I guess the question that's going through my mind is everyone's been talking about systems, right? It's a hot topic. We just heard from Jeff Walker and SSIR about the systems entrepreneur. I'm also reaching a conclusion that maybe scale and systems change is sort of post-innovation. In other words, I mean, certainly the research that you showed has innovation as this little box that happens here, and 95% of the rest is going to scale. I mean, do we need to kind of like stop worrying so much about innovation and sort of scoop up the things that people figured out 5 or 10 years ago and just work on like turning the crank and bring, is that really what systems change? Sort of, it's not about innovation. If you want to go to scale and systems change, forget about innovation, start just executing. I don't know. I just have to ask this question as someone who's kind of stuck in the innovation boat here.
Before I allow our panelists to answer, I just looking at my team, SSIR team, so are we going to rename the magazine Stanford Scaling Review or something, or System Review? Renee.
Yeah, I had a thought on that. I think, and again, in the case I just mentioned, hopefully, it's the original innovation the entrepreneur had to let go of and be open source. So now they're doing technical assistance, they're doing training, they're doing products and tools that allow governments to be, so it's a totally, so I'd say the innovation shifts, so it's never in a box, done, now we're just gonna, I think actually that could limit the scale if you don't adapt and become, but that's a real test. Some of our entrepreneurs look at us and go, that's not what I'm interested in. I want to just keep doing this. And that's great. But then this could be lost, that other opportunity.
Yeah, we also, we do these big system maps, but at the end of the day, you can only affect a very small part of that system. And we think it's a leverage point, and there's a set of learning. But where that leverage point is, there's almost always innovation. And so it's, you have to invest in there and innovate in that particular area and make sure that you're getting the cause that you think you're trying to get.
Sorry, just one more quick point, Jim. I think you're right. We talk about systems entrepreneurship, social enterprise. I think it's a little overdone, to be honest. I mean, I think we're kind of throwing these terms out that then social entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs have to adapt and say, no, I am a systems entrepreneur. Give me money. I'm over here, really. I'm doing systems entrepreneurship. And so I think that incentive is not so great. I think the concept of what we're trying to get across is wonderful, and the learnings, that's great, but to kind of label things so differently, it's all the same work, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's different. And again, it's different because of stage. So for sure, Healthy, it's Rebecca's incredible what she accomplished, but it wasn't easy for her, and there were days when, the failure curve was apparent, and then, it takes tenacity. For us, what we're solving for when we decide to invest is intentionality. We are trying to figure out as early as possible, does this team, does this entrepreneur have a sense of the end game? The so what? They're obviously motivated to change conditions in some environment in some meaningful way, but 90%, 75% at the end of the day, the work that they are doing ultimately to change a system is to get a government, a sovereign, somebody who has the capital, the capacity, the authority, and hopefully the legitimacy to adopt it to make that change possible. So the words, are totally overused, but intentionality and really being clear, both at the entrepreneur level about why you're doing what you're doing, and for the funder to be clear, how does it all end, is, I think, really what's important.
So I understand there are not many questions here, but
May
don't.
I also say something?
Yeah, just 1 second. I just want to encourage you, if you don't have a question, just bring forward answers as well. So I really encourage you to go to the microphone. Christian.
Allow me for a moment. I want to address Jim's question, should we slow down innovation? And I want to be ultra provocative here, and maybe doing this in Silicon Valley is committing suicide. But I say yes, we need to slow down innovation dramatically for 3 reasons. First of all, I think we have most of the solutions for almost all of the problems, social and environmental problems in the world. We don't know how to implement them, and we don't have the right governance systems of making them effective. The second thing is innovation is not a very productive use of resources because of the high failure rate. Playing around with failure may be sexy in Silicon Valley, but playing around with innovation failure is not smart in a rural village in India where people are dependent on very few things. There's no insurance system, there is no health and safety and legal systems that would protect people. And by the way, we need more and more innovations to deal with the negative undesired consequences of past innovations. Think about fossil fuel, now we need green technologies for climate change. Think about antibiotics, now we need super innovation against resistant bugs. Think about the automotive, air pollution and noise pollution and so on. Think about plastic, which is, now we need innovation to clean up the oceans. I think we need to turn down the rate of innovation, and we need to be much more reflective and conservative going forward. But it's not compatible with the way markets work or with the way the public sector is set up, which relies on GDP growth and constant job and productivity increases. So we are stuck.
On that
Do a tour
note,
of board meetings. See how the founders take that message.
on that optimist note,
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So my name is Erin Robb. I just defended my PhD in education, which takes a systems perspective on schooling here in the US. And I ended up reading a lot into systems literature. And I was wondering, when you think about them, if you think about them from an ecological model, from an organizational model, from an engineering model, from a computing model, right? There are so many ways of thinking about systems, and I'm wondering if you have different ways of thinking about systems in your different organizations, or if you have a completely different metaphor or model that you're working off of.
Roy, you are engaging with a lot of experts on systems. Do you want to take
we
it
don't
first?
do predictive. These are one way to describe what we do is like performance art. Okay, it's you actually you create causal loop maps, but it's quite beautiful and complicated. But it's a way to get a group of people to say, this is the way the world is. This is the way we think the world is. But it's just a picture of the world. But there's value in creating a common picture and a common language. And as long as we don't get stuck on the map, we're okay. The problem is people get, that is actually reality. No, maps are almost never actual realities, right? You look at the subway system, the subway map of London, England. That's no connection to reality, but it's actually quite useful to get from A to B. And that's what we're trying to do, is understand some of the causality so we can pick a small part and actually have a narrative of how it's going to potentially feed into a larger system. But I am an engineer by PhD, and I've done those really complicated system things. Not super helpful in the world we live in right now.
Anyone else? Otherwise, we
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think it's a storytelling tool, to be honest, because to get other people in, whether it's funders, whether it's policy actors, whether it's business people, and if the entrepreneur's at the center trying to create that collective, it's very hard, the one-offs. And so if there's some anchor, and we try not to get lost in the uber complexity either, if you can simplify that and get agreement, it's really helpful.
Just wanted to thank the panel. It was really interesting to hear your insights. I work in HR, and my work revolves around rewriting corporate policies to help vulnerable populations gain employment. And I think one of the hardest things in my work is unintended consequences. So I was wondering if you guys could share some insights or learnings from your research and work around when you're doing systems change or when you're rewriting programs or creating innovations, how do you think about planning for when you change one thing, something worse happens to the most vulnerable populations that you're actually trying to help? That'd be great. Thank you.
Before you go, can you just give us an example of what you're talking about? So what's an unintended consequence of the space you're working in?
Yeah, absolutely. So to be really concrete, when you're trying to get people who have never had experience in the job market a job, for example, you'll create short-term jobs. And so what happens is you get people without credentials and experience into the labor market, but then you create a gig economy where they're actually even more vulnerable and they don't have access to benefits and they don't have access to like long-term employment, and they become even more vulnerable even though you've given them access to jobs.
I think it's a wonderful question, and we run into unintended consequences of strategic actions all the time when we work with and then analyze organization. What is interesting for us and for Christian and myself is to understand how unintended consequences factor in your strategizing, and again, going back to our first round of questions about learning, do you factor in unintended consequences that come out from the work that the organizations that you invest in do, that you factor them in your next round of investments? Or do you find that investees do not really share unintended consequences? Is it that you have to find out about them yourself?
For us, so when you're trying to address homelessness and systemic homelessness specifically, or opportunity. I think one of the daunting challenges is you can find short-term housing. You can definitely make that happen. But that is not likely to be persistent. It doesn't in and of itself change the conditions for that person or that family or deal with a host of codependencies and a whole host of issues. And I think, so the answer is, again, by our stage, by the length of our investment cycle, we're not going to make investments where we knowingly can't understand to the best of our ability, and we're known for doing God knows how much due diligence, but it's for a purpose. We're really trying to figure out what we don't know. And so in housing and in homelessness, I think it's pretty clear you need to have supportive systems around that for economic opportunity and getting people to have the first ladder of opportunity for jobs. There's a whole host of things. So one of our investments is actually Lava May, which basically has portable showers going in San Francisco. I mean, it's ridiculous when you think about the number of showers in the entire public showers in the city of San Francisco. It's like 16. And if you don't have the dignity of a shower, let alone clothes, how are you going to have employment even if it's given to you? And so, again, back to the systems map on criminal justice, we're trying to figure out, okay, where's the point where we can actually have meaning and then build on that. And so, yes, there's unintended consequences for many things. At the stage in which we're making investments, we're trying to rule within the best of our ability what those are and understand what those are as a way of mediating them.
Thank you.
So, it's a really good question. So 4 points. One, I think we're not very good at it. Two, good system maps are supposed to do that. They're supposed to like get you to think about, okay, if this happens, what else happens? That often depends on who you have in the room, though. So for an organization that will remain unnamed, I walked in, they were doing a system map of U.S. education, and there was not a single person of color in that room, right? And they're doing a system map of education in the United States, where 51% of kids are from communities of color. And if you don't have the right people in, they're not going to see the unintended consequences. So the importance of getting diverse groups of people together so that you can actually get closer to the truth is needed, and it's really hard. And then 4, the system, you're supposed to, once you have a system map and you're investing, you have to get lots of feedback so that you capture those unintended consequences as quickly as possible. And most people just are not paying attention enough. And I think we're, sometimes do that.
I would agree. I just a couple of quick points. One, I think if you really spend the time, and we do the same thing, sometimes we're criticized for as much due diligence, but if it has to be with the folks that are on the ground in a comprehensive, partnered, humbled, listening way that's not a top-down strategy. And where I see that happen the most, and particularly here in the Valley, is the technology solution that's going to apply and save everybody. And I think we've seen it time and time again, and that is it's a burden for entrepreneurs. It doesn't work. I mean, there's phenomenal technology solutions, and Jim from Benetech can tell you what's working and what's not. But the amount of money and deployment of that going down into a community that fails, and then the disheartened, the backlash, the ramifications, which last a long time. So I think that for us is top of mind, and it's not easy to do, per Roy's point, but it's a great question and something to be mindful of.
The problem is that a lot of the unintended consequences are only manifest after a while, and that's really the hard part to then integrate it into due diligence. We have room for one last question.
It actually, in some ways, can you hear me? Okay, great. It ties into the question, sort of. So I'm a nonprofit scholar who looks at organizational fields or systems and looks at marginalized communities. So my question for you actually ties to the system question, which is, how do you conceptualize social entrepreneur? What's their profile? And how does this link to the themes of knowledge and innovation that you raised in the early talk and this conversation right now?
So I think we have here 3 organizations that have a particular way of operationalizing who is a social entrepreneur or who is an organization they invest in. Perhaps we can just briefly go through it, but...
So we have, again, it's informed now by the 110 plus investments we've made. So we have a very strong bias for founder-led organizations. And my general response is that, again, to this due diligence, the characteristics that are likely to make entrepreneurs have the capacity to get through an inordinate amount of no's and constraints and to live through the down cycles and still have the aspiration to continue are a set of personality attributes that our biggest benefit that we have is that we have pattern recognition now. The biggest asset we have is that we can look back over 15 years and 110 investments we've made. In 5 years, we'll have made 200. And we can begin, and to this point about, we really do, today we were doing an after-action report about ourselves, trying to understand how did we make this investment, what did we miss, what do we need to do, and so we're constantly pushing ourselves to understand not our successes, those are easy and apparent, but really where are our failures and where did we miss? And a vast majority of that effort is understanding the leaders that we're backing, because we are definitely backing leaders in the first instance.
Yeah, early stage entrepreneurs, you have a little bit of a mix, but more established organizations that you invest in. A lot of the organizations that we study actually are, of course, also part of your...
Yeah, it was great to see the overlap in the cases. So we're at the mezzanine level from a nonprofit perspective, which means, we wanted at least a, decent track record, a proven impact model, preferably, upwards of a $2 million budget that again, so that we can then look at that inflection point and help scale. But I'd say to your question about the profile that we're looking for, it's, there were 5 things that came to mind for me in thinking about this conversation. Absolutely the exceptional leader, but the team culture they're creating of partnership, not just with and specifically with the community they're working with, but also with, again, openness to government, business, other local organizations so that there's leverage. And then I would say they're developing an adaptive model. It's not a proprietary model that they're looking, that their intentionality is it's an openness and they're trying to solve the big problem. It's not that they're going to want to scale their organization. They want their model to solve a problem. And the organization is secondary. And then the last thing would be, they're willing to invest in some of the hard things like measurement. They're willing to work on their own deficits. So again, where we might come in and see opportunities for partnerships, whether that's leveraging other kind of skill sets, whether that's collaboration with other organizations that we think is important or could provide value, they're open to that. Those would be a few things.
I would just be repeating Jim and Renee's answer.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful round of discussion here. I gladly give back the microphone to Kim.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we can all see that the complex problems of the world demand equally complex solutions. So what good fortune today to have these 5 individuals on stage and their expertise. Please join me in thanking Jim, Renee, and Roy for joining us on the panel with their particular lens from their organization. And then, of course, Johanna as the moderator, and Christian for giving the keynote, and of course, for Johanna and Christian authoring this marvelous new book. So with that, we thank you. We invite you to join us for a reception after, and look forward to more conversation. Thank you.